In today's video, we're looking at the horrifying deaths of criminals whose final moments came at the jaws of wild animals, from a silverback's sudden charge in the forests of Virunga to a lion's ambush in the tall grass of Limpopo. But first, in the Pantanal of Mato Grosso, a jaguar attacked a man near the river's edge. It was July 14th, 2013, on the edge of Mato Grosso, Brazil. It was the dry season in the Pantanal, with low rivers and cooler nights. The grass was tall, and the searchers moved carefully through the trees. For the men searching that night, the jungle carried not only darkness, but also the sense that something was present, hidden within the brush and trees around them. Diego Alvarez, 29, had once been known in Cuiabá for being quick with his hands and having a short temper. He worked random jobs on construction crews, but had turned to stealing and attacking people. His criminal record went back nearly 10 years, with time in jail and long periods of hiding. He had gotten used to slipping into rural areas when police got too close, surviving on farm scraps and help from people too scared to turn him away. On the night of July 13th, a robbery went bad in the city, leaving Diego running from the law. He headed south, toward the forests that had often given him cover before. His reputation went ahead of him. Farmers along the edge of the Pantanal wetlands knew him by name. Some said he had been living like a ghost in the brush for weeks. Others warned police that he was dangerous but also desperate. When word came that he had been seen near a small cattle farm, authorities moved fast. They got two local men who knew the land well to help track him, knowing the area was thick with hidden water channels and dangerous animals. The search party pushed into land where the farm turned into jungle. The air was wet and heavy, carrying the smell of damp soil and rotting plants. Mud grabbed at boots, and insects swarmed around lights. Beyond the tree line, the Pickery River split into narrow channels, each thick with tall grass and floating debris. The locals knew it as Jaguar territory. Big cats had been spotted along the riverbanks that month, one of them large enough to leave paw prints nearly as wide as a man's hand. Jaguars, the biggest cats in the Americas, thrived here. They weighed up to 250 pounds, with powerful jaws built for crushing bone. Unlike lions or tigers, jaguars often hunted by surprise near water, dragging their prey into rivers to drown it before eating. Their bite was stronger than any other cat, powerful enough to crack a skull. Farmers who lived nearby carried rifles not just for wild pigs, but to keep jaguars away from their livestock. In recent weeks, calves had gone missing from pens not far from where Diego was now moving. Warnings were everywhere. Farmers had told officers that the riverbanks were unsafe at night, especially after the rains made the currents stronger and the mud heavier. Park rangers had put up signs along trails after several reports of jaguar sightings. Even the ground carried reminders, large paw prints pressed into the mud, some still fresh, small pools of rainwater resting inside. Anyone familiar with the forest knew what those marks meant. But Diego, with police closing in behind him, paid them no attention. His only thought was to cross the river and lose his trail. Near midnight, he reached a shallow bend where the water spread wide and slow. Witnesses said the night had been unusually quiet before the first sound of splashing. Diego waded carefully, one arm raised to keep his bag out of the water. Then a low growl broke the silence. From the tall grass came the jaguar, its body low, its eyes fixed on him. Farmers watching from the far bank shouted, but it was too late. The animal leapt, its jaws clamping onto Diego's shoulder. The water rippled and broke around them as he thrashed, his movements frantic against the jaguar's strength. The attack happened quickly. People watching described hearing the jaguar's growl mixed with Diego's screams. The cat changed its grip, biting around his head. His body moved once more before the sound stopped. The police had only handguns, and these were not safe to use against a jaguar at close range, so they held back. The jaguar pulled him under the water, which moved around before going still. The entire fight lasted less than 2 minutes. The river had small ripples afterward. Officers looked through the tall grass with flashlights, but saw only muddy water. Farmers stood back quietly, with the sound of insects slowly coming back as the night settled again. Diego did not surface. By morning, searchers moved carefully along the bank. They found pieces of clothing caught in grass and drag marks leading into thick brush. Not far away, they found remains that had been partially freshly eaten, bones marked by teeth. His small bag and shoes were found nearby, soaked and torn. The authorities put out a short report later that day. It said simply that Diego Alvarez, wanted for robbery, had died while running through restricted land. The statement mentioned only wildlife as the cause. One local newspaper covered the story with a short article, noting the dangers of moving at night in Jaguar country. There were no big headlines beyond the region. Diego's funeral was small, with only close relatives attending. No photos were taken. To the family, it was a loss. To the police, it was the end of a chase. For the farmers, it was proof of what they already knew. In those wetlands, the forest gave no protection to the desperate, and the jaguar remained the silent ruler of the riverbanks. From those waters in Brazil to the forests of Virunga, another trespass ended just as suddenly, this time under the force of a silverback. It was April 22nd, 2014, in Virunga National Park, Democratic Republic of Congo. The thick forest pressed close against the border areas, with the treetops blocking most of the afternoon light and making everything look green and dim. The park had long been a place of both beauty and danger, home to armed guards, endangered animals, and people who came in for reasons that rarely ended well. Samuel Ochieng was 33 years old, a Kenyan smuggler whose name was known along parts of the Congo border. He had grown up working random jobs in small towns, but turned to illegal trading when quick money proved easier than steady work. By his early 20s, he was moving stolen goods across borders, then switched to smuggling ivory. Local people described him as clever but careless, willing to take risks where others would not. Getting arrested in Kenya had slowed down his work for a while, but in 2014, he was back in business, crossing into Congo with two men he trusted. The plan that month was simple. They would move through Virunga after dark, looking for paths to move ivory tusks out of the park and back towards the border. The routes were dangerous, not just because of park rangers, but because of the land itself. Still, Samuel believed his knowledge of trails and his confidence in the wilderness would get them through. He had done it before. The local people had warned that gorillas were active in that area, especially a known silverback that led a family group in the thick plants. But Samuel ignored the advice. For him, the risk from wildlife was nothing compared to the money he could make. Virunga was filled with plants and animals. Vines hung low across narrow paths, and the ground was covered with leaves that softened each step. Insects buzzed constantly, and the heavy air made walking slow and tiring. The men carried machetes to clear the brush, their shirts wet with sweat. Rangers following at a distance saw them pause often to catch their breath. Even in daylight, the forest felt tight and pressing, with sounds that were hard to place: bird calls, the snap of branches, and thunder far away. The eastern lowland gorillas that lived here were among the biggest primates in the world. Adult silverbacks could weigh well over 400 pounds and stand nearly 6 feet tall when standing up. Their arms were strong enough to break branches thicker than a man's wrist, and their bites could crush bone. They were usually peaceful, moving through the forest in family groups, eating leaves, fruits, and stems. But when threatened, especially when young ones were nearby, a silverback could fight back with terrible force. The warnings had been there. Village people had talked about broken branches, fresh droppings, and tracks pressed into the mud. The rangers watching Samuel's group saw signs of gorillas on the same path, flattened plants and chest-beating herd in the distance. But the smugglers kept going, focused on their route. Samuel, leading the way, ignored the sounds and kept cutting through brush. The encounter happened suddenly. As the men stepped into a small clearing, they disturbed a family of gorillas. From the edge of the trees, a large silverback rushed forward. The two rangers watching from nearby saw Samuel lift his machete, but he could not use it. The gorilla struck him hard, sending him backward into a tree. The noise of the collision carried through the clearing before silence returned. Samuel hit the ground hard, trying to crawl away. The gorilla came forward, hitting with both arms. Each blow landed with heavy sounds, crushing his chest and breaking his ribs. His partners ran into the forest, yelling in panic. The rangers, though they had guns, did not shoot. Their job was to protect the animals and record what happened. They yelled and hit trees, trying to get the silverback's attention, but the gorilla ignored them until Samuel stopped moving. His body moved once before going still. Only then did the silverback step back, beating its chest before going back into the plants, leading the rest of its family away. After it was over, there was silence, except for the distant calls of birds returning to the treetops. The rangers came closer, carefully, finding Samuel motionless, his chest chest crushed from the force of the blows. His machete lay several feet away, half buried in leaves. The rangers secured the area and waited until daylight to move the body. By morning, Samuel's remains were taken out of the forest and examined. Severe injuries from being hit were clear: multiple broken ribs, collapsed lungs, and breaks from being slammed against the tree. His clothes were torn, soaked with blood and dirt. There was no sign that he had been eaten. The gorilla had acted in defense and left once the threat was over. His burial was done quietly near the border. Only a few close relatives were told, and there was no ceremony beyond a simple grave. The authorities put out a short statement, saying only that the death happened during suspected illegal activity inside Virunga. No international news carried the story, and within days it faded from local talk. For the rangers, it was another entry in their records, proof of what happened when people crossed into protected land. For villagers, it showed that the warnings given should not be ignored. In Virunga, where wildlife was pressured by poaching and smuggling, the balance was always fragile. Samuel's death became one more case of human risk met by the strength of the forest's defenders. His body was taken from Virunga quietly, buried with only close relatives present. Officials reduced the event to a short note, citing illegal activity within protected ground. There was no ceremony, no public account beyond that. Months later, far to the south, in Limpopo, another trespass took place, and this time ending in the tall grass where a lion waited. It was February 11th, 2015, in Limpopo province, South Africa. The heat of the day had settled into heavy darkness, and the night air carried the uneasy quiet of the bush. For those who worked the game reserves, the silence was rarely comfortable. It meant predators were moving. Elias Mokoena was 41 years old, a man whose name was whispered in local villages. He had been arrested several times for breaking into places, but rarely stayed in prison long. After each release, he returned to the same habits: small thefts, catching antelope with traps, and sometimes breaking into nearby ranches. Local people said he knew the land too well and had always found ways to slip away before being caught. Hunting wild animals had become his job, not just to survive, but for money, selling meat to buyers who did not ask questions. On that February night, Elias made his way toward a private game reserve known for its high fences and valuable wildlife. The reserve had antelope, wildebeest, and other grazing animals, easy targets for traps. Carrying an old knife and 2 wire traps, he climbed over the outer fence under cover of darkness. For him, the risk was familiar. He had done it many times before and believed that speed and quiet would keep him safe. What he did not know was that guards had already seen movement on their cameras and were watching from a distance. Land inside the reserve was wide. Tall grass bent in the light wind, and thorn trees stood in groups on the dry ground. Insects buzzed near the waterholes, and the smell of dust and animal waste stayed in the air. Guards with flashlights stayed back, walking slowly along the fences and dirt tracks, watching from a distance to see where Elias would move. Lions were common in this area, their presence one of the reasons the reserve was valued. Adult males could weigh more than 400 pounds and stretch nearly 8 feet from nose to tail. Their jaws, with 3-inch teeth, could put out enough pressure to snap a spine. Lions hunted mostly at night, using the cover of grass and the quiet of their padded paws to surprise their prey. While they preferred antelope, buffalo, or zebra, lions would not hesitate to attack a human who came into their territory. There had been warnings. Local people often talked about lions walking close to fences, leaving paw prints pressed into the dirt roads. Rangers put up notices near villages that poachers risked not only arrest, but attacks from predators. Elias, who knew the area, ignored these signs. He believed the lions stayed deeper in the reserve and would avoid humans. Guards later said they saw him put down his traps near a patch of tall grass, working quickly and without hesitation. The attack began quickly. As Elias bent to place one of his traps, a lion moved out from the grass. The guards heard his scream in the dark, followed by a deep growl. The lion leapt with its full weight, pushing him flat onto the ground. The ground shifted as he struggled. The wire of his trap caught beneath him. Guards noticed the sounds more than the sight. The rip of fabric, the thud of paws on the ground, and Elias's cries that turned weak. The lion bit into his leg first and pulled him several feet into the grass. The crack of bone was heard in the night. Elias struck with his knife, but the lion shook him hard and overpowered him. When the guards pointed their flashlights towards the noise, they saw the lion's huge head bent low, its jaws locked around his neck. The cat shook once more, the movement ending all sound from the man beneath it. His body went limp as the lion let go briefly, only to drag him deeper into the grass. The guards did not move forward. They knew trying to help without rifles would be suicide. They stood back, waiting until the sounds faded into silence. By morning, rangers followed the drag marks through the grass. They found scattered remains near a feeding area, bones and clothing torn apart, with blood staining the soil. His knife was found nearby, stained and dropped in the fight. The traps lay left behind, one half buried in dust. The lion had eaten and moved on, leaving little more than pieces of what had happened hours earlier. Authorities told the family later that morning. The burial was small, with only close relatives attending, and no public ceremony. Local people who heard about it shook their heads, but were not surprised. Poachers had long been warned of the dangers, and many saw the death as something that was bound to happen. The reserve put out a short statement, describing the incident as a result of trespassing into protected land. No names of the guards were given, and the report got only a brief mention in regional news. The lion was not bothered or moved. It had acted naturally in its territory. For the guards who had watched the attack, the memory stayed. Elias's scream cut short by the strength of one of Africa's most feared predators. For the reserve, it was another note in a long record of trespassers who underestimated the land. For his family, it was a quiet loss, marked without public attention. His name spoken only in the village where he once lived. His life did not end in prison or in court, but in the tall grass where lions still held their ground. At dawn, his remains were found near a feeding site, scattered and incomplete. The burial was small, with only close relatives present. Authorities released a brief statement, naming trespassing as the cause, and the event faded quickly from wider notice. 2 years later, far from Limpopo, another man crossed into restricted ground, and this time in the Sundarbans mangroves, where a tiger waited unseen. It was August 19th, 2017, near the border of the Sundarbans mangrove forest. The tides shifted with the moon, and the air held the smell of salt and damp earth. To visitors, the forest seemed unknown, but to locals it was known for danger. Few went into the restricted zones without cause, and many who did not return. Rakesh Verma was 27 years old and newly out of prison after serving a sentence for armed robbery. He had grown up in a poor district in India, drifting into crime as a teenager. Short sentences never slowed him down, and his reputation became that of a man who sought quick profit wherever he could find it. After his release in mid-2017, he joined a group of men who were harvesting timber illegally from the Sundarbans. Demand for mangrove wood was high, and the profits were worth the danger. Rakesh's work was basic, from cutting trees with an axe to carrying the logs, and leave quickly before rangers arrived. He had no family responsibilities and little to lose, which made him an easy recruit. He had entered the Sundarbans once before, narrowly avoiding detection, and believed he could do it again. Though he knew the forest was tiger country, the promise of fast money outweighed the warnings. The Sundarbans was a labyrinth of tidal rivers, mud flats, and dense mangrove trees. The air was thick and humid, filled with the buzz of insects and the distant calls of water birds. The ground shifted between firm roots and patches of soft, sinking mud that clung to boots. Fishermen and honey collectors rarely moved here without permits and protection, for the boundaries marked areas known for man-eating tigers. Even from the water, the forest looked dense, with twisted branches hanging over dark channels where little could be seen. Bengal tigers were the main predators in this forest. Adult males in this region weighed about 400 pounds, with some growing larger. Their bodies were built for moving quietly, and they could run in short bursts of 35 to 40 miles per hour. In the Sundarbans, tigers had learned to hunt differently than in open grasslands, moving silently through water and mangroves, ambushing prey from behind. Attacks on humans were not rare here. Locals told stories of men dragged from boats or seized on muddy trails, their remains never fully found. Signs of danger were clear. Villagers who saw Rakesh and his group heading into the forest shook their heads, saying no one should go in without protection or a permit. Rangers had posted signs near the boundary, warning of restricted zones and recent tiger sightings. Fresh paw prints had been seen along the mud flats days before, but the men ignored the signs, carrying only axes and ropes as they crossed deeper into the mangroves. By late afternoon, they had cut a small clearing, felling logs and stacking them near the riverbank. The forest fell into an uneasy quiet. Fishermen in a boat not far from shore later said they saw the men moving quickly, but heard little bird call or monkey chatter around them. That silence, to locals, was its own warning. The tiger moved out of the mangroves, unseen until it attacked. Witnesses said they saw orange and black stripes rush from behind the trees. The animal lunged and locked its jaws on Rakesh's neck. His scream carried over the water, loud and brief. He swung his axe but struck nothing. The tiger's weight forced him into the mud, and within moments it was dragging him backward into the brush. The group scattered in panic. One man stumbled into the water, splashing as he climbed into the boat. Others ran into the trees without direction. Fishermen later said they heard Rakesh's cries, strained and fading, as the tiger pulled him into the swamp. The noise of breaking brush and mud followed. The men who escaped did not return to look for him. The fishermen stayed at a distance, unwilling to risk their lives by approaching. They said the forest grew quiet, save for the soft lap of water against their boat. The tiger, with its kill secured, disappeared into the mangroves. Searchers returned days later, guided by rangers. They found fragments of clothing tangled in roots, streaks of blood dried on mud, and drag marks that ended at a dense patch of forest. No body was ever recovered. The river tides and the tiger's feeding habits left little trace. His axe was located a short distance away, half buried in wet soil. The family received only what could be returned, his belongings and the confirmation that he had died inside the forest. The funeral held in his home village was symbolic, with prayers offered in the absence of a body. There was no large gathering, only immediate family and neighbors. Local rangers issued a short statement afterward, reminding the public that entering the Sundarbans without permits was both illegal and dangerous. They noted the area as high risk for tiger activity and warned others against attempting the same. For the fishermen who watched from their boats, the memory remained, the scream, the sudden blur of stripes, and the silence that followed. In the Sundarbans, even seasoned men spoke carefully of the forest, for they knew it belonged to the tiger. The following year, on the far side of the continent, another man broke rules for a smaller gain, and this time it was not a predator cat, but chimpanzees that brought his life to a violent end. It was October 14th, 2018, near Gombe Stream National Park in western Tanzania. The sun was setting behind the hills, and the air was heavy with wood smoke from villages and the damp smell of the forest edge. The day ended quietly for most, but for one man, the evening brought a choice that would not pass unnoticed and would soon lead to his death. Joseph Mwangi was 35 years old, known across villages as a petty thief. He rarely stayed in one place, moving between towns along Lake Tanganyika. His crimes were small: stolen chickens, missing bicycles, food disappearing from sheds. But his persistence made him a problem. Some said he survived by stealing from outsiders, especially tourists who left gear or food unattended. By late 2018, rumors spread that Joseph had been stealing from temporary camps set up near Gombe's boundary. That evening, Joseph crossed into the forest edge, with his eyes on a camp set by visiting tourists. The group had put up tents under the guidance of a local tour guide. Food was stored in a canvas tent near the edge of the site, and as the sky got dark, Joseph slipped past. To him, the risk was small. The tourists were busy with dinner preparations, and he believed he could grab supplies and disappear into the trees before anyone noticed. The setting carried its own warnings. Gombe Stream National Park was thick with plants, steep ridges, tangled undergrowth, and tall fig trees that cast long shadows. At night, the forest grew louder with insects buzzing, frogs calling, and the rustle of unseen movement. The tourists who stayed nearby were often told about one rule above all others: never leave food out in the open. The reason was simple. Chimpanzees roamed freely here, and food theft often brought them to camps. Chimpanzees were powerful animals, far stronger than humans of similar size. Adult males could weigh up to 130 pounds, but carried muscle that allowed them to deliver crushing blows. Their jaws, built for cracking nuts, could tear through flesh and bone. Known for intelligence and group behavior, they defended food aggressively and reacted violently when threatened. Rangers often reminded visitors that chimps were not tame, that they could and would attack humans who crossed them. Clear warnings had been given. Villagers said chimps had been seen searching for food near campsites in recent weeks. Guides noticed broken branches and droppings close to the trails. Earlier that day, several tourists mentioned that a group of chimps had stayed nearby, watching from the trees before moving off. Joseph focused only on what he could take, ignored it all. He entered the food tent, ripping open plastic containers and bags, leaving scraps and pieces scattered around. People watching later said the sound of screaming came first. Out of the trees came a group of chimpanzees, drawn by the smell and noise. They moved quickly, surrounding Joseph before he had time to run. He grabbed a stick and waved it wildly, but the chimps screamed louder, their teeth showing. The tourists and guide stood frozen at first, shocked by the sudden chaos. The first chimp jumped forward, biting its teeth into Joseph's arm. He shouted and hit with the stick, but more closed in, grabbing at his clothes and pulling him to the ground. The clearing was filled with noise from the attack, screeches from the chimps, fabric tearing, and Joseph's cries. The guide shouted and threw rocks, but the chimps held their ground until Joseph fell down. The chimps bit at his face and arms, tearing deep wounds as they swarmed around him. One bit onto his leg, while another scratched its nails across his chest. Blood spread quickly across the dirt. The tourists backed away, some covering their mouths, others pulling out phones before being told to stop. The guide continued throwing rocks, but only after about 3 to 5 minutes did the chimps retreat, climbing back into the trees one by one. When the noise stopped, Joseph lay motionless. His body was covered in blood, clothes torn to pieces, skin ripped in multiple places. The stick he had carried was broken in half beside him. The camp fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant calls of night birds. Rangers got there later that evening, called by the guide. They came closer carefully, worried about the chimps returning. Joseph showed no signs of life, his injuries too bad. They wrapped his body and carried him out under torchlight, the tourists following quietly behind. His remains were taken back to the village, leaving behind only a trampled patch of earth and the scattered food scraps that had started the attack. The funeral was held the next day. It was small, with only close relatives attending who accepted the body without ceremony. There were no long speeches or memorials, only the quiet burial of a man who had lived on the edges of the law. Authorities put out a short report describing the death as the result of trespassing and theft. They warned again of the dangers of approaching chimpanzees and reminded camps to secure food. There was no broader coverage, only whispers in nearby villages and the memory of those who saw the attack happen. For the tourists, it was an image they carried home, the sudden violence of animals defending their territory, and a man whose last act was reaching for food in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thanks for watching. But remember, when people cross boundaries, they were never meant to. Nature does not forgive. Another story is already waiting on the end screen. Click it if you're ready to face another final moment.